Hello everyone, this is Ether Dragon, and welcome back to another episode of Fire Emblem Heroes. In this episode of the Damage Calc series, we will be taking a look at damage reduction, which is quite popular nowadays. So let's just get straight into it, because it might be a long episode. We'll see how long it is. But we're just going to go through some of the common ways you'll see damage reduction. This is not a comprehensive list like always. You just gotta keep an eye for the key term, or phrase, which is reduces damage. That's basically the main thing you gotta look for. That'll indicate damage reduction. Typically, you're gonna be reducing the damage of the foe's attack, which is another thing you'll see that's common. But let's just go through the list here. We have Sacred Cowl, Aegis. These are range damage reduction specials. And then we have Ice Mirror on Fjorm, which is similar to Sacred Cowl, but it has an additional effect on top. Then on the melee range spectrum, we have Escutcheon and Pavice. And it's important to note for this that these specials do proc against close counter units that are countering from melee range, hence the wording of these specials. So say Pavice was active on Brave Ike and he were to attack into, I'll just say close counter Nino because I use that. Then when Nino counters, Pavice does proc because Nino would be countering on a tile adjacent to Brave Ike, so that's just a side thing to note. And then here we have the more recent Legendary Corn with Negating Fang, which is basically a combination of Escutcheon and Sacred Cowl built into the same special, and like Ice Mirror, it has an additional effect. So now let's go to the seals in the game that give some damage reduction. We have stuff like Deflect Magic, Deflect Melee, and Deflect Missile, however you want to pronounce it. And so all of these have the same idea of reducing damage from consecutive attacks from a foe, but only the second attack onward, aka these seals can never reduce the damage of a foe's first attack. I know this can be a bit confusing for people, but the whole idea is it'll proc in scenarios where the enemy attacks multiple times before you get to counter. So, for example, some scenarios where these deflect seals will proc are, for the first one, say you have a brave weapon. So if the enemy attacks one time and then the second time because of the brave weapon, the second attack is going to be reduced by the deflect seal if, of course, it's the applicable unit. So for like deflect magic, units like Reinhardt, where with Dire Thunder, he'll attack once and then attack twice immediately. The second attack is going to be reduced, but not the first attack. If like a unit quads in desperation range, so like a Brave Bow Archer, so there would be like the first attack, second attack, third attack, and fourth attack all at once before the enemy gets to counter. The second, third, and fourth attacks all get reduced by the damage from those second and third. The second, third, and fourth attacks will get reduced by Deflect Missile. And then there's things where you get quadded, but you counter in between. So say Reinhardt's running Lance Breaker against Fjorm and just ignore all her other skills besides Lepter, which allows her to counter Reinhardt. So Reinhardt would get his first and second attacks in consecutively. So the first attack would do its full damage. The second attack would be reduced by... The damage from the second attack would be reduced by Deflect Magic. But then Fjorm counters, so then that breaks the consecutive streak of attacks. So Reinhardt's third attack is going to do the full amount of damage, but then again, the fourth attack is consecutive to the third attack, so the damage from the fourth attack would be reduced by Deflect Magic as well. Those are kind of the general ideas behind it. If you're a bit more confused about it, we'll be going into plenty of examples in future episodes. So stick around for those. Those will come around eventually. Trademark. But anyways, moving on. Let's go into some B skills that grant damage reduction of some sort. Here we have Shield Pulse on Fjorm. And so Shield Pulse only procs again if a foe's attack triggers special, which at this point in the game means these damage reduction specials, just any of these, procs Shield Pulse. And so the only thing you need to know about Shield Pulse is it gets factored at the very end of everything in damage calcs. So after everything's said and done and you have some amount of damage and haven't applied Shield Pulse reduction yet, that's when you do it, at the very end. So super straightforward, nothing too mind-blowing there.
Very well.
Then we have Crusader's Ward on Sigurd here. Very similar to the deflect magic and deflect missile seals, but this just checks if the unit's range is equal to 2, aka any ranged unit. As long as they attack consecutively, those second attack and onwards will get reduced. And then we have the more recent spammed out damage reduction B skills that work against AoE specials and all attacks during combat as long as it procs. So Dimitri here, Blue Line Rule, checks his defense against the opponent, and he can get up to 40% damage reduction against the enemy. And Sayri here of Close Call, there's also Repel and Spurn. All of them are speed-based damage reduction B skills that, again, like Blue Line Rule, maxes out at 40% damage reduction, but it's all in increments of 4% depending on the difference in speed. And now going into weapons, there's so many weapons out there, but just to name a few, we have the more recent Dancer Eldigan here, a Courtly Candle, which can reduce the damage from the foe's attack if the foe can basically double. And Divine Tearfing on Sigurd here just reduces the damage from a magic enemy's first attack by 50%. And of course we have Irvon on Brave Ike, which it just does lots of damage reduction in that weapon. And so those are just a few to name. The main thing we gotta talk about is how you work with them and what happens when you gotta when multiple damage reduction sources proc at the same time. So first, let's just talk about very briefly how to compute just a simple damage reduction. Say you're just proccing Aegis against the ranged unit that's attacking you. All you have to do is compute all the damage. You just have to compute the enemy's attack, your relevant defense or res, compute weapon triangle, effective damage, any modifiers to defense or res like a special like Luna, or maybe you're on a defense tile. And then you apply any forms of boosted damage, like say proccing Bonfire, or maybe you're running a damage multiplier special like Glimmer. You apply that, and whatever the scenario is. And then if there's any dealt damage, you add that in. And after all is said and done, you come out with some amount of damage, and that is the damage amount you use to compute with the damage reduction. So let's say after all that's said and done, the enemy attacking Sheeta, the ranged unit, is doing a base 10 damage to her. And so when Aegis procs, it just reduces that damage by 50%, so it comes out to a nice 5 damage instead of 10. If it was, say, Sacred Cowl, that 10 damage would be reduced to 7, because 30% of 10 is 3, so Sacred Cowl reduces the damage taken by 3, 8, so that results in the overall 7 damage taken. Super straightforward. But now, the slightly more complicated part is when you combine multiple sources of damage reduction, they all proc at the same time. And there's a bunch of misleading things about that everywhere online, but the actual mechanic is it's a multiplicative stack. So no, you don't add the damage reduction numbers together. It also just wouldn't make sense. For example, say Irvan's base effect here about the consecutive attacks procs and deflect melee also procs. You wouldn't be reducing damage by 160%. That doesn't make any sense. You would actually, it turns out you'd actually be reducing damage by 96%. And here's why. So the way I'm going to talk about it is typically how I think about it. There's other ways to think about it, but I think about it in terms of working with them one at a time and seeing what the overall damage reduction is going to be. So if we start with the consecutive attack damage reduction effect from Irvan here, so 100% means 100. If I say 100% damage dealt, that means you're doing the full damage. So Irvan reduces the damage by 80%. So that 100% damage would be reduced to 20%. So you're only doing 20% of your normal damage. So now if you look at deflect melee when it procs, it also reduces the damage by 80%. So out of that remaining 20%, you reduce it by 80%. So after that's all said and done, you're left with 4%. So when these two proc in conjunction with each other, overall it's a 96% damage reduction because the enemy is only doing 4% of their normal damage. Or the usual damage, I should say. And if we're stacking stuff on top even more, if Pavice triggers, instead of that 96% damage reduction, it would be 98%, because that remaining 4% would be halved, resulting in only 2% left. So overall, out of the 100% possible damage dealt, it's dropped all the way down to 2%. And of course, it doesn't actually matter what order you do it in. Just to show you, I'll start with Pavice and go in some other order. So with Pavice, you go from 100% to 50%. If you proc the proc Irvan here, it goes from 50% down to 10%. And then if you use deflect melee, it goes from 10% down to 2%. So the order doesn't matter. The only important thing is you figure out exactly how much damage or the actual percent reduction, and you don't chop off any of the numbers. That is important because when you do things like, for example, these like close call here, maybe if Sayuri is like 7 points of speed faster than the enemy, then she's gonna have 28% damage reduction against the foe's attacks. But if she's also proccing like deflect magic, for example, let's say deflect magic 1, then it gets complicated because so you have the 100% to start with, and then the 28% from close call drops that down to 72%. And then from that 72%, you have to get rid of 30% of that. So you're going to have a percentage with a decimal in it. So like, this is completely arbitrary, like 52.4%. So you got to keep the 0.4%. As far as I know, the game doesn't chop things off. I haven't found a way I can accurately test all of this, but the margin of error of chopping off the decimal causes things to go wrong in some specific scenarios. So you always just want to keep all the decimals around. And we'll get into the more fine details of that when we get really far into the latter part of the series, but just figured I would just introduce it here, and so you'll get an idea more of what it's like later. But at this point, that's literally it about damage reduction. It's actually a super simple concept. It's just actually computing the damage reduction can be a bit annoying. So of course we're going to be covering that later in the series. But until then, that's going to be it for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to be moving to the second part of the series where we actually calc stuff. Amazing. Now that I've basically covered almost all the mechanics for actually doing damage calcs, now we have to go into the application portion where we actually number crunch and get the calcs actually done. Because there are some nuances with rounding or chopping off decimal places, or what to apply first, how you apply things together. All that stuff we're going to be covering in the second part of the series, so you can look forward to that starting in the next episode. But anyways, thanks for watching. As always, this is Ep.10, and hope to see you all next time. Bye!